Origins of the Korean War. The United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea and the creation of two Koreas.
Soon after liberation from Japanese colonial rule, with the Americans occupying Korea below the 38th parallel and the Soviets occupying Korea north of the 38th parallel, politics in Korea became much more polarized between the left and the right. Below the 38th parallel, the United States Army military government in Korea directly governed the population. Civil affairs officers who staffed the United States military government were supposed to be absolutely first-class men, capable of shouldering, quote, the burden of reconstructing the world. Indeed, at the end of World War II, in Europe, North Africa, Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, American civil affairs officers governed over 270 million people, a number larger than the population of the United States at the time. Accomplished in fields like civil engineering, education, law, policing, public health, civil affairs officers with 70,000 US troops in Korea laid the foundation for what will become the South Korean state in 1948, including its police force and the military. In conventional official narratives about the Korean War, what the United States Army military government did and did not do in the 1945 to 1948 period is glossed over. In South Korea today, the Korean War is usually referred to as 6.25, 6.25 전쟁, or the June 25 War. June 25, 1950, is South Korea's and the UN's officially sanctioned date of the war's beginning, when the North Korean army began a general attack south of the 38th parallel. The Korean War as 6.25 portrays South Korea as a victim of communist aggression, and the United States and the UN as saviors of South Korea. When conventional official interpretations consider the historical origins of the Korean War, why there are two Koreas in the first place, it's Soviet ambitions that are blamed. Soviet ambitions are blamed for the division of Korea along the 38th parallel in 1945 and the Korean War in 1950. This view says that Soviet policies at the end of World War II were rooted in its desire for possession of ice-free ports, and that this long-held Slavic ambition came to be coupled to the Kremlin's strategic goal of worldwide communist domination. Soviet Union and Kim Il-sung, acting as puppets for the Soviet Union, rejected proposals that would have created a unified government. And in 1950, at the instigation of Stalin, Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, launched a premeditated attack against South Korea on June 25, 1950. According to President Truman, President of the United States, the Korean War was to be, quote, the first step in a general communist plan to pass from subversion to armed invasion and war in their general scheme of world conquest. A more liberal perspective began to emerge in the 1960s. For the initial decision to divide Korea, for example, this view placed equal responsibility on the United States and the Soviet Union. After all, the proposal to divide Korea along the 38th parallel was made by the United States which the Soviet Union had accepted. This view sees that initial agreement to divide Korea as a way to establish a political modus vivendi on the Korean Peninsula. This view, which we could describe as Korea as victim of big power rivalry, this view says that at the time of liberation in 1945, Korean society, like all societies, had its class conflict and political differences. But the division of Korea and the Korean War was something that was imposed from the outside. With the sudden collapse of the Japanese Empire and the occupation of Korea by Soviet and American forces, this view says a minority on the extreme left and on the extreme right could successfully push for the creation of separate states in an opportunistic grab for political power. This view says although it was Kim Il-sung who started the Korean War, the Korean War was essentially a proxy war. And the Korean people became caught up in a conflict that was not of their own making. And thus, Koreans were victims. Starting in the 1970s and 1980s, what we might call post-Cold War scholarship began to emerge, although the Cold War was still going on. In the 1970s and 1980s, while not ignoring the geopolitical position of Korea and the impact of the American-Soviet rivalry on Korean politics, historians like Professor Kang Man-gil, who taught at Korea University, drew attention to the development of the Korean National Liberation Movement during the colonial period, the political resuscitation of former collaborators and other anti-national elements under the United States Army military government in Southern Korea after 1945, and the subsequent exacerbation of conflict between the left and right, which would lead to the creation of two Koreas. When Kang Man-gil published these studies, the Cold War still gripped South Korea. Thus, as a public intellectual, Kang Man-gil pointed out courageously that by treating the Korean War and everything that led up to it as having been determined by the deepening of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the proponents of Korea as victim narrative had, in effect, erased Koreans from Korean history, but more importantly, that liberal view had freed from blame those Koreans who should be held responsible for Korea's division. For historians like Kang Man-gil, the Korean leader most responsible for the creation of two Koreas was Syngman Rhee, who became the first president of South Korea. In the 1980s, another version of what we can call post-Cold War scholarship was put forth by Bruce Cummings at the University of Chicago. Bruce Cummings locates the beginnings of the Korean War in the revolutionary, counter-revolutionary struggles in southern Korea in the years between 1945 to 1950. Put simply, the Korean War was a civil war that actually begins around 1948, if not earlier. The revolutionary struggles of these interwar years between 1945 and 1950 in southern Korea had to do with trying to overturn in spite of the United States Army military government, the regressive effects of Japanese colonial rule. That is to say, the perpetuation of Korea's traditional landed class, a class that had actively supported the Japanese Empire, and the exacerbation of oppressive landlord-tenant relations in the countryside. Now, of these narratives, which narrative do you think is the most compelling? We heard Dean Rusk say that American post-war planners were surprised when the Soviet Union readily accepted the American proposal to divide Korea along the 38th parallel. To both Americans and Soviets at the time, Europe was the most important arena in terms of geopolitics. The Soviet Union accepting the American proposal to draw a line along the 38th parallel in 1945 was, for the Soviet Union, a concession made to the United States so that the Soviet Union could drive a much harder bargain in the region, in the area that it cared most about, and that is Europe and to some extent Japan. 3 weeks after Japan surrendered to the United States, US troops landed in Korea. Did the Americans land in Korea as a liberation army? Or did they land as an occupation army? And if they landed as an occupation army, what kind of an occupation would it be? Very quickly, the United States made it very clear that it would be an occupation. And this is confirmed in the very first message communicated to the Korean people by the US Armed Forces. This was in the form of about 300,000 leaflets dropped over southern Korea between September 1 and September 5. On one side, it was printed in English. On the other side, printed in Japanese. This message, this very first message, signed by General Hodge, begins this way: to the people of Korea. The armed forces of the United States will soon arrive in Korea for the purpose of receiving the surrender of the Japanese forces, enforcing the terms of surrender, and ensuring the orderly administration and rehabilitation of the country. So, first sentence, we're coming, and why we're coming. We're coming to receive the surrender, to enforce the terms of surrender, and something much more open-ended, to ensure the orderly administration and rehabilitation of Korea. Second sentence, these missions will be carried out with a firm hand, but with a hand that will be guided by a nation whose long heritage of democracy has fostered a kindly feeling for peoples less fortunate. Who we are. We are a democracy with a long heritage of democracy, and we have kindly feelings for people like you who are less fortunate. How well and how rapidly these tasks are carried out will depend upon the Koreans themselves. Hasty and ill-advised acts on the part of its residents will only result in unnecessary loss of life, desolation of your beautiful country, and delay in its rehabilitation. This sentence here is a clear threat. Don't act hastily. If you act hastily or ill-advisedly, and then in the passive tense, this will result in unnecessary loss of life and desolation of Korea. Present conditions may not be as you would like them. For the future of Korea, however, remain calm. Do not let your country be torn asunder by internal strife. Apply your energies to peaceful pursuits aimed at building up your country for the future. Full compliance with these instructions will hasten the rehabilitation of Korea and speed the day when Koreans may once again enjoy life under a more democratic rule. That is to say, under the US occupation, it would not be a democracy. But if Koreans fully comply with the orders of the US occupation, then the day will come much faster when you may once again enjoy a more democratic rule. Subsequently, and just in case the message was not clearly received, Proclamation number 2, issued on September 7th, 1945, and this time by General Douglas MacArthur himself, states, "Any person who violates the provision of the instrument of surrender or any proclamation, order, or directive given under the authority of the Commander-in-Chief, United States Armed Forces, Pacific, or does any act to the prejudice of the good order or life, safety, or security of the persons or property of the United States or its allies, or does any act calculated to disturb public peace and order or prevent the administration of justice, or willfully does any act hostile to the Allied forces shall, upon conviction by a military occupation court, suffer death or such other punishment as the court may determine." As the United States Army military government officers explained later, south of the 38th parallel, the United States Army military government in Korea had taken onto itself all the sovereign power that had previously been held by the Japanese colonial government. That sovereign power included, as we saw above, the power to kill. There are less sort of dire or dramatic examples. For example, a captain. A captain was in charge of transforming what used to be Keijo Imperial University into Seoul National University. That captain would have the final say in who would be hired to teach in the history department. That's why, for example, Baek Nam-un, one of the leading historians in Korea at the time, and a Marxist, would not find a place in South Korea. Instead, a historian like Baek Nam-un will go north of the 38th parallel to teach at the newly established Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang. In the opposite direction, many more came south, especially Christians, landlords, those who had actively supported the Japanese Empire. And many of these people were strongly anti-communist, and they added fuel to the left-right conflict that would begin in the American zone.